panel, I'd like to first ask Steve Venema, representing the Boeing Corporation, to introduce himself and his background.
Hi, yeah. Is that working?
It is.
Okay. My name is Stephen Venema. I work at Boeing. There's a few other Boeing folks out there, too, that you'll see. We have the interesting dual viewpoint of where we build things, particularly for the government, but we're also a large consumer and a large target for security issues. So I wear the hat of both looking at issues from a futures and what's coming and what do we need to look at to incorporate, and also how the heck do we make this stuff work on a really large enterprise. So, and sometimes those are, I'm self-conflicted about that, as I imagine many of you are. It makes for a really interesting job.
Dave Waltermire from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. My team at NIST manages the National Vulnerability Database at the NVD and all of its information resources. And we also maintain the Security Content Automation Protocol, or SCAP. My work is primarily working across government as well as industry to develop use cases, collect requirements, and then ensure that we're working with the appropriate standards development organizations to address those use cases and requirements.
Phyllis?
Hi, my name is Phyllis Lee. I'm the NSA IAD Security Automation Program Lead. Similar to Dave, my role is to, in NSA IAD, we're already working on the standards. We work on TCG, different groups in the IETF. Is to lead across government, work outside with government and industry to help put the standards in place that we need for security automation.
All right, thank you. So to set the stage, let's talk about network security and how we got to where we are today. I'm sure many of you have been involved in helping to create secure private networks in your organizations, and we've been doing that for a very long time. And we had a set of tools. We had firewalls, ACLs. We kind of understood what we needed to do until just a few years ago. And then we started to see our perimeters fail. Our infrastructure shifted from wired networks to wireless networks. And now along comes the unmanaged bring your own device. So now it's not just the standard endpoint, the standard laptop that companies provision and establish a good security foundation on those devices. It's devices that are pretty much from anyone, from partners, from employees. So we have to make better, smarter risk decisions when we figure out what to do as new devices are recognized or unusual behaviors are recognized on our networks. So this is where standards really come into play. We tried proprietary mechanisms going back maybe 10 years. We saw a number of competing mechanisms in the marketplace, and then we gradually shifted to a standards focus, such as represented by the efforts of Trusted Computing Group. And that was certainly a step in the right direction, but we haven't seen a lot of industry drivers that really took us to the point of let's figure out how to exploit these standards. So I'd like to open the first question to the panel around the role of interoperability and standards in helping us do a better job of security automation on our networks. Steve, we'll just go down the panel.
Okay. So there are a couple of drivers I think maybe I'd give a little more emphasis than you did on. The BYOD, you could almost think of that as a predecessor to that is something we see a lot at Boeing, which is a huge supplier network, and more vendors who have access to our network, customers who have access to our network for just basic business needs. And we see that whole B2B space just growing tremendously. And to me, BYOD is they're very closely related. So that's part of the driver that I think that we see. And then, like many companies, we've had to deal with various proprietary solutions over the years. And one of the things that, again, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, that really is a driver for us is the cost of dealing with different systems. And how can we use standards to simplify our ability to manage these in a cohesive, coherent way, and at the same time give us the ability to introduce new technologies and products as they come along to get our own best of breed in that space. So.
Yeah, I think I have a similar message on that. It's so most organizations have a multi-vendor suite of tools that are assisting them with the various processes that that they're operating to ensure that their devices have the appropriate level of hygiene to minimize security, surface area, and to deal with threats. And the interoperability that's provided by standards is important to enable that type of multi-vendor environment in a way that reduces the level of investment, of additional investment that the organization has to make to integrate those various solutions together to actually put in place the kinds of tools that will work together to address those needs. So standards are critical from that perspective.
Yeah, so I'm in total agreement with what Steve and Dave had said. So
That's no fun.
we need our different product lines to be able to talk to each other. We need, so I won't repeat what they said, but what we also need is we need our tools to automatically generate indicators that we can send to our partners, and their tools can automatically ingest them so that we can take automated action on the network, right? And so the key here, it really is the automation. We need things to be machine generated and machine ingested and then take action right away.
Great.
And we can only do that through standards.
Well, this is going to be pretty boring if the panelists always agree with each other. But of course, I didn't expect anyone to take the standards are no good approach on the panel. But so let's look at some of the changes in the landscape for network security. Our firewalls are becoming smarter. We're relying on more attribute information when making that decision on whether to let them in or not. And for that matter, especially as you mentioned the partner scenario, Steve, we're trying to do things to segregate the devices as we recognize them based on what we know about them. And this is really all around the architecture of attributes and how that attribute information gets collected and shared. How do you think, have we done enough as an industry? Are we becoming more mature in how we leverage information about devices as we see them in the network to make good, smart decisions? Steve?
Well, I think because our threat landscape is changing so quickly, that one of the areas we need to grow into is our ability to respond rapidly to the changing threat environment. And this is an area where TCG is involved in looking at not only evaluating the health of endpoints, but actually looking at the continuous monitoring part of that. And it's not just TCG, there's some interesting things going on in some of the other standards community. But to me, that's a real growth area that we need to grow into further to basically reduce our cycle time to respond to threats as they evolve. To not just evaluate it as a machine comes on the network, but say, hey, this is behaving poorly.
So continuous monitoring, near real-time information on the status of the devices and any changes.
And again, and then from an operational perspective, how do you make sure that itself doesn't become a denial of service type of thing? Make somebody look bad and get them blown off the network, or things like that. There's operational considerations too.
Dave?
It's a good thing that we have, we already have a lot of different sensors deployed across our networks that are gathering information about the security posture of our endpoints, the kinds of behavior that users are exhibiting on the network. The real challenge is we don't have the necessary standards in place to enable that information to be pulled together to provide an overarching situational awareness viewpoint of what's going on across our enterprise. And that's critical to allow decision makers to factor in all of the current operating state of the network to make effective risk-based decisions. But it's also important to allow our tools to be able to take autonomous action as well. The same information that's supporting users can support those tools to make really fine-grained decisions that are needed to secure our networks. So I think really the role of standards and the interoperability that they provide is allowing us to synthesize and expose that information to the enterprise to apply advanced analytics on top of that information that will then drive various security practices. I think that's where we can leverage the standards that exist today as a foundation, but also where there's plenty of room for additional work to be performed in the future.
So we've come a long ways in the last 10 years, but there's a lot of more work to still be done here. I'm sure all the people whose professional status depends on work in the standards community will be very grateful for that assessment, David. Phyllis, do you have a perspective on this?
Yes, so I agree. So I think when we want to know, when we talk about continuous monitoring and situational awareness, we need to know what is on the network today, and quite honestly, how are we doing asset management today? Proprietary protocols and tools have their limitations. We need to have true insight into what's on the network. So what is on the network, and then we need to know how is our network behaving. We need to do that behavior monitoring, get the data back from the sensors in a standardized way so we could actually take action knowing what's on the network, how is it behaving, we can correlate this data. And eventually, what we want to do in a standardized way is, of course, command and control over our network. Once we actually know what is actually going on the network, how is it that we modify the network to defend ourselves? And unfortunately, we don't have that whole picture today via standards. We have bits and parts via proprietary solutions. But I think that right now, the community is ready, at least definitely in government, and I think also private industry, to push for those standards.
Certainly, we've seen a lot of public incidents and even policy initiatives around doing more around security of our critical infrastructure, initiatives like the new Cybersecurity Act, et cetera. So there's certainly a lot of awareness in industry right now, and hopefully that will galvanize and we'll see the resources being put into new standards and the things that are missing today. Let's talk a little bit about BYOD, because this is a conversation I have with customers pretty much every day. What do I do at a policy level? How do I recognize when it's a BYOD device, and then what do I do about it? Steve?
I'm still processing the question, sorry.
Well, if you'd like,
yeah,
David,
let's skip on. I'll come back.
We can come back to you.
Well, there's certainly challenges with BYOD. A lot of the panelists before us actually talked quite a bit about a lot of the root of trust issues that are going on there. On some level, though, I'd rather not explore where they're different, but more focus on the areas where BYOD is actually fairly similar to other classical computing devices. There are devices that need to be authorized to do various things on our networks. There are devices that we need to understand their security posture in general, so we need to look at the software inventory of the device. We need to know that the operating system, the critical applications are being patched appropriately. We need to understand if they're configured appropriately, and if they're not, we need to communicate what the appropriate configuration posture should be for those devices. We're looking a lot at existing standards in the current arena that can address these types of issues. So one standard that we're looking at quite a bit is the software ID tagging standard, which is a specification produced by ISO. I think it's 19770-2. And it enables organizations to receive accurate software inventory information about what's going on a given device. I think there's opportunities in the mobile space to integrate with various application stores to deploy these SWID tags onto a mobile device to allow us to get that accurate software inventory. We're also looking at various approaches to configuration management. We would like to get to a place where operating systems and applications can expose their configuration settings within the software itself and make that information available to the enterprise. We're also looking at ways to use things like the Security Content Automation Protocol as a way to capture indicator information about things that are going on the device. So where we find that there's software present on the device that isn't part of the positive software inventory, you could say, we can use things like SCAP to do further exploration of the device to determine if there's malicious software present. We can also deploy signatures through information sharing to those devices and use that to check for known bad indicators of malware.
Do you have anything you want to add, Phyllis? Or?
So Dave and I work a lot together, so a lot of things that he says I'm in total agreement with. So I want to, kind of, I guess, reemphasize what he said. It's not just about bringing a new device onto the network. It does have its challenges, especially with mobility, the data at rest issues, what kind of access are you going to give someone who's outside your network versus someone who's already inside your enterprise, and what you need to feed those decisions. But we're in total agreement where these are the kinds of checks that we're going to do frequently on the network to devices that are already on the network. When you're still on the network, we still need to know that you are in compliance with our security policy in case something has happened since the last time we checked. So there are these differences which are major, but a lot of the things do overlap to check to see if you're in compliance with the security policy.
So the other thing I'd like to add to this discussion is just the notion of how this affects our security zoning models. That it's not just the external network, the DMZ, and the internal network anymore, especially given the kinds of devices that simply show up. We'll try to categorize them, and the most common approach that I've seen a lot of clients do is leverage machine cert to make the determination between whether this is a managed device or an unmanaged device. And then you go on to other attributes like its security posture, location information. So as many attributes as you can, it just allows you to make a better decision about where you're going to place that device in your network zoning model. We've seen the emergence of something that we call a limited access zone. So this is a semi-trusted device, if there is such a thing. It's a device that you're going to allow a very limited amount of access to specific systems, but more than just a guest. And many devices will, of course, just fall into whatever your guest access zone is, and you'll give them external connectivity subject to some policy controls. But so that's kind of what we've seen happen in the network zoning models. Many of my clients, as I talk to them, they'll certainly scan and pay attention to what they know about the configuration of the device, but they're very reluctant to completely block them from doing any work because that has an impact on their business. So often they'll monitor. If they don't like what they see or they're sort of out of compliance with policy, they'll put them someplace where they can still do some work, but they're really making a risk management decision. I'm not going to allow this device to be part of my trusted or restricted internal networks. But I'll let them do some things until we can dispatch somebody to help them mitigate the out-of-policy conditions with that device. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about critical infrastructure and how that might be different or create special challenges. I mean, clearly, as soon as we get into the notion of control systems and the critical infrastructure kinds of services where you really want a higher standard of access control on it. This seems like it's a great application area for something like security automation and for that matter, Trusted Network Connect as well. So Steve, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, the problem space there is fairly immense for a couple of reasons. First of all, everything you said is correct. You want to protect these devices because of the physical effects that if bad things happen, it's not just loss of data, it's loss of our heat and power or what have you. But we have some things working against us. One is the life cycle of these products is often decades. So even if you put something new in today, it may not comply with the normal expectations we would expect from a security posture perspective. So the hard part is to figure out how to protect them and yet not expect sort of a wholesale replacement of them with the latest and greatest gadget every 3 years like we do oftentimes in our, say, our server space or endpoint space. Very, very hard problem, and one I'm very interested in and working on, as well as many others in Trusted Computing Group. We have a draft specification out now for public review that I would encourage any feedback any folks would have. It's called a metadata for industrial control system security, and it's about how to coordinate and manage the security of a protection framework you put around these kinds of devices. I won't say any more on that here, but that's one of the areas that I find most interesting.
So it sounds almost like a second perimeter. There's the perimeter to the public network and then the perimeter around some of these.
We introduced the concept of overlay networks that institute their own protections on top of whatever you have in your regular IP network. One of the drivers for that is that in many cases, the underlying network and communications infrastructure isn't owned and managed and trusted by a single entity. So if that's the case, how do you support that kind of framework to allow your systems, oftentimes these are called SCADA systems, which are supervisory control and data acquisition systems. How do you protect those when the underlying network isn't inherently trusted and maybe shared? And I think you'll find some demos back there of some folks who are looking at products and capabilities that you'll find interesting in that space if that's an area of interest for you. So,
Well, let's go to Phyllis so that she can mix things up and get the head start on David at least.
So, not to be contrary, but I would argue that a lot of the security automation standards that we are trying to put in place would be due diligence for our critical infrastructure, right? And so the challenge to us is to create the standards so that they have enough variability to have the interoperability, but also to support special critical infrastructure. I think SCADA is a prime example of where you really, we have to be able to support the policies that they need. It has to be flexible enough, but you need to be able to interoperate. Maybe you need to think about a federated model. All these types of things that we need to make sure that the standards can support. But again, really security automation and the things that we are promoting are due diligence for all enterprises, including critical infrastructure.
I think, yeah, we're kind of touching on a common point, which is that the result of any action that you take may have to be different.
That's right.
The impact of that action might be different depending on the type of device that you're dealing with, right? If it's a SCADA system and it needs access to network resources to communicate with other systems, you can't just kick it off the network, right? Because it'll impact the manufacturing process or whatever else it's controlling. Which is why we need the ability to make more fine-grained choices about how to interact and manage that device. And by putting in place, so TNC actually provides a lot of the foundation that we need to be able to fine-tune those access control decisions. But what we're lacking today are the additional standards that allow you to take a more holistic view of how that device is interacting with external networks, with the larger enterprise, and being able to look at what user behavior or device behavior is doing to the network, and then be able to factor in those observations in making finer-grained decisions about how to manage the device. So I think work needs to be done to enable us to take that more holistic view to do fine-grained things like making sure that patches get deployed to the device without impacting its operations. Restricting access to some network resources, but not all of them, so that it can work through an attack or work through an insecure situation. I think those are critical.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave.
I'll just add to that traditionally we look in security, we look at a triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and we often think of those as being listed in priority order. In critical infrastructure, it's probably more the reverse order. Availability first, integrity next, confidentiality last, if you have to prioritize the three. And that may be a little bit different way for people to think about this stuff.
All right, we're going to start taking questions on the center aisle mic. And I have a, so if you do have questions, please make your way to the center aisle. I do want to add something to this discussion because a conversation I have with clients is about how do I allow a vendor to externally support a device that's on my critical infrastructure network. So they can't always dispatch someone to locally be there to perform that function, but they want to limit them to make sure that they can only touch a certain device or a certain set of devices. They want it to be a cryptographically secure session, and they want to have very tight privilege user monitoring controls on those kinds of interactions. And we're starting to get there. We don't have a good standards basis for that kind of solving that vendor support problem in the SCADA environment. Mm-hmm. I've seen some specialized VPNs and some other specialized secure shell products that try to solve the problem, but I think we're not quite there with what I'd call an industry standard solution yet. Okay. Do you want to add?
Sure. Yeah. So we see this problem in my own company, where we'll have automation, say, at one site, and we may have a support person at a different site. And how do we temporarily give them specialized access, say, for diagnostic or debugging purposes? One of the challenge with many of the different technologies we have today is, let's say, like a VLAN technology is when it doesn't scale well in terms of large sites or dynamic permissions about things. So like you said, there's different VPN type of solutions. How you do those, the standards part of that really gets, I mean, we all know how to do IPsec, although sometimes getting different clients on IPsec to work together is a little dicey. But it's the policy side of it. How do I let Alice access the control system in this particular place, but not all the other things that around it, because that's just the thing they need access to. And just to drive home your point about the remote access, one of the real drivers in the industry for that is that we're moving more to a leased model for many components in large industries. So, for example, in an oil field, there's these very large compressor stations that pressurize a well to bring out more of the product that they're pumping. Those are turning into lease models, and the owners of those want access to their specific equipment to monitor it, do condition-based maintenance, and so on. So that's part of the driver for it. Just thought I'd drive that home a little bit.
Great. Okay. Well, let's take our first question from the audience.
Alan Karp, HP Labs. You talked a lot about intra-enterprise notification. What about inter-enterprise? It would seem to be valuable to know that a company in the same line of business is under attack and what the attack is.
Great question.
Yeah, on some level, one organization's attack is another organization's early warning or defense, right? And I think part of what we can enable through the use of the kinds of monitoring technologies that we're talking about is collecting data about what happened during an attack, auto-generating signatures, sharing those signatures through ISACs and other coordinating bodies to allow other organizations to import those signatures, in an automated way, deploy those to their tools using the kinds of interoperability standards that we've been talking about, and then use that to detect when a similar attack is actually occurring to their enterprise. So I think the types of standardization that we're talking about enables that type of environment.
It's unfortunate we aren't doing it more often. I mean, we see isolated instances of that kind of sharing occurring, but and maybe this is one of the benefits that will come as new legislation moves through the Congress, at least in the U.S., is create an environment that's more conducive to sharing without people feeling that they're exposing too much information. Especially around security, we're very sensitive about exposing our weaknesses. At the center aisle mic.
So it seems to me that the threat landscape for ICS systems has really changed radically in the last 2 years. things that were theoretical possibilities become actual possibilities. The idea of blowing up somebody's, destroying somebody's industrial control systems remotely from half the world away is no longer a theory. We know that it's happened. Now, there's still some work to be done on the part of the attackers to operationalize that and have that become routine. I hope it takes them 20 years, but I suspect it won't. Whereas if we look on the IT side of things, we did have 20 years. We really had 30 years from the time of the first viruses and the Morris worm to today. We have these very sophisticated APT attacks. So there's quite a contrast there. In IT, we had 30 years to learn how to deal with this, and we're still struggling to deal with it. Whereas in the ICS side of the world, they're getting a couple of years at most. On the other side of things, the life cycle for IT equipment is 2 years, 3 years, 5 years at most, whereas the life cycle for ICS equipment is 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. I mean, these things are major capital expenditures that are amortized over a long period of time. So it seems to me inevitable that those ICS systems that we have today, those legacy systems that are known to be insecure, dramatically insecure, are probably going to be with us for quite a long time. How do we deal with that reality? Or am I wrong and there's some way that we're going to be able to solve that problem?
Well, you're right. Especially with that kind of capital investment, you can't necessarily replace the product. You can't even necessarily upgrade the software to make it less vulnerable. What you might be able to do, though, is to create a different kind of a perimeter shell around it. One of the earlier talks, we discussed something like web application firewalls. And that's to compensate for weaknesses that occurred when they first programmed the application, that you've externalized some of the kinds of filtering and checks of the interactions with the applications that sit behind it. And that's kind of a temporary measure that really, until we have software that's inherently secure and perhaps even provably secure, that could never happen, but we may need to have these intermediate layers, a defense in depth strategy. Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, ladies?
I agree, absolutely, that we need a defense in depth strategy. Oftentimes, and this is something that we deal with at NIST, actually, we have very expensive scientific equipment, some that are running legacy OSs that are 10, 15 years old. And our ability to patch those OSs and keep them up to date with the latest software is hampered by the cost of doing that ultimately, right? You would have to recalibrate the device, you would have to pay an extreme amount of money to get a newer version of that piece of scientific equipment. So we do need to put in place other perimeters. And I think this is where I'm most excited about the work that's going on in the TCG, because it allows us to look at a more holistic approach to doing security that goes beyond just the basic network hygiene of the device. And we can understand behaviors on the network and how other devices are interacting with that device, and we can make the appropriate security and access control decisions to protect that device. We can see early warning signs through events that are occurring on the network that would lead us to take the right kinds of actions to secure the device.
About medical equipment in hospitals, it's another good example where you've got a piece of very expensive equipment, and every time you make even a minor change to the software, it has to go through a very expensive recertification process, so you'd rather not touch those, which means if you're going to overlay security, you have to create another layer, something that protects the device, makes it less vulnerable, but doesn't break its certification.
The important thing also to point out is this is a huge win for just regular computing devices that we can manage on that 2 to 3 year cycle, because it's another piece of early warning that can be leveraged on top of the basic network hygiene capabilities that we're deploying to detect attacks.
We have another question at the center mic.
Stephen Sprague, Wave Systems. So my question wraps around the context of really all of these pieces put together, and actually the the panel is a fantastic group to answer this. One of the challenges we've had is the transition from a user-centric model of the network, which is where we are today. 90% of the people in this audience doing an enterprise network are user-centric, to an identity of the device-centric, which is really closer to defining mobile. And so you talked about bring your own device, identity of the device, attributes, integrity of those attributes, et cetera. Well, the challenge we have fundamentally is if I want to show up as a contractor working for Boeing on some project, because they use lots of contractors, and I want to bring a device that, for example, has to assert its data at rest capability, then what I need are adequate specifications to define the minimum qualifications of that attribute. I need NIST standards to define what the minimum capabilities are to prove my device. It's not hope and pray my device has a data rest, because Boeing has a government commitment signed contract that says all devices will have data at rest. So they don't want to have to check. They want automated security. And so I'd like the panel to address a little bit how you think with standards like TCG, the depth that we have already in the presentation of those standards, you can absolutely prove today that a self-encrypting drive is present on a specific machine as a third party to Boeing as a contract owner, that this machine has data at rest in it. However, you look at NSA's current articulation, NIST standards definition on how you would actually do this and whether it actually meets the minimum requirements, whether I'm or not I'm allowed to use TPM as a device identity in U.S. federal government for this purpose as an alternate credential, because FIPS 201 doesn't contemplate a non-FIPS certified TPM. So I would argue today that one of the huge inhibitors of the actual adoption of this technology is part of also the process of enabling it. And so we're at, what, a little more than 500 million, on our way to 1 billion devices, depending on who counts. So at what point in time does it get to be a big enough thing where somebody really gets more seriously engaged in pressing forward the articulation of use? Because in reality, from a panel perspective, we've talked around all this, but we need to take a specific example and go through and say, okay, what's NIST's role in this? What's NSA's role in this? Right. What's Boeing's expectation? Because Boeing just wants to know what's there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So we agree. That's
easy.
Next question. No.
Yeah.
That was so easy. I need a harder one. No. No, we agree. And so it's true. Machine identification is non-trivial. The fact that I need to trust that when you self-assert who you are, that I know that that is definitely you. Whether or not we roll that in with the TPM, what is NSA's role in that? Is NIST going to put out the IR or the special plug? And so we realize this, and we realize that in order for this to really be effective, in order for it to scale, in order for government to require this in procurement, in order for all these things to happen that we believe need to happen, in order for these security automation standards to be supported natively in our IT, we need to do exactly what you said. We need to work through an example. We need to provide the specifications either through the TCG or through some other means so that from end to end that we can actually have a viable solution. Now, it's an iterative process, right? So you have to be patient with us. So the first go around, are we going to roll in TPM with machine authentication? Maybe not. We need to be able to do, at some point we have to require things that our customers are capable of doing today, knowing that it's going to be an iterative process and that we can get to the ideal situation sometime in the future. Because at least from the government side, what we've done before is we want the perfect solution, and then that's a big turnoff, and it's we can't get that done today, and it kind of becomes a checkbox requirement. How that's met, people get to decide, right? So we want to do something that's more meaningful and write down the specifications. Unfortunately, that's not there today, but it is something that we are actively working on.
So in 2007, we got OSD, specifically Wave Systems helped OSD to add the context of TPM required on all OSD procured equipment. I'm sure you've seen John Grimes' memo on that. So the concept of patience is an interesting one here. I would say we're at, 98% of all DoD PC assets have TPMs today. We have guidance from Office of Secretary of Defense. You have the NIST specifications 800-155 and 800-147, or the guidance there that's including it. And yet we still sit around and wait for NSA IAD. There certainly have been things that have been appropriate that have been done so far, but also the pace with which this is being executed. And still, even in your response, it's a question of maybe we'll use TCG, maybe we'll not. Well, okay, so what is a competing technology to TCG? Let's stick to PC platforms for a second, because certainly mobile has alternate schemes. But there's no contemplation of putting ARM trust zone into PCs and then replacing the entire PC infrastructure in the next, short lifetime in this space. So I think this is part of the challenge of it's time to actually move the energy level on this substantially to take advantage. We certainly have the risks out there.
So I think 2 points on that. I think that the challenge is we don't want to build a house of cards at the end of the day, right? We want to make sure that we're putting in place the right kinds of foundational capabilities that we can then build on in the future to enable more and more functionality, more and more security, ultimately. And I think there is a lot of that work being done as far as the development of standards, releasing guidance, to provide hardware root of trust and other capabilities. The other thing is, we're at NIST, we're willing to work with any standards organization that's promoting the right kinds of technology, and from that perspective, there's a lot of good work going on within the TCG, but there's also other standards going on within ISO, within IETF, that we're also wanting to integrate with this solution. A lot of the work that we're trying to do is less of developing new standards, but more of developing profiles of existing standards to kind of show how you use a suite of standards together to actually solve these problems. And I think that's one of the missing pieces that actually gets to answering your question. The other thing, too, is to look at this more as not just a national problem, but an international problem. If we want to get vendors to actually adopt these capabilities, we need to make sure that they're promulgated through the appropriate international standards bodies so that the adoption can be broad, and we all benefit from that.
Well, I'm sorry that we've come to the end of our panel time. If there are questions out there. I'm sorry, we don't really have time for any additional questions. I'd like to thank my esteemed panelists, and I believe, well,